Hey, welcome to Horror Ecos. Before we start, just a quick note. After the first few minutes, the rest of the video plays without breaks. So get comfortable and give it a try. I think you'll enjoy these stories. If you do, you can like and subscribe. Only if you really want to. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time it is for you? I read them every night. All right, let's begin tonight's story. Stories start now. The ghost who came back thinner with more hair. There's something most people don't understand about ghosts and spirits and how we perceive them. We think that when we see a ghost, we're seeing an actual physical entity walking around in our world. We imagine that spirits have some kind of semi-solid form that exists in our reality, visible to those who have the ability to see beyond the normal spectrum of perception. But the truth is far more interesting and complex than that simple explanation. What we're actually seeing when we encounter a spirit is not the spirit itself, but a mental projection. An agreed-upon image that our consciousness creates based on information we're receiving from the other side. This understanding completely changes how we think about hauntings, about communication with the dead, and about the nature of consciousness itself. And nowhere was this more clearly demonstrated to me than in a conversation I had with a nip detective on the set of a movie, where he told me about his daughter seeing his deceased partner in their kitchen every morning, looking younger and thinner and happier than he had been when he died. But before I tell you that story, I need to explain the research and understanding that led me to this conclusion about how we perceive spirits. This isn't just speculation or theory. This is based on years of work filming people who have accessed their loved ones under hypnosis, through mediums, and through their own natural abilities. What I've learned has fundamentally changed my understanding of how communication with the deceased actually works. Let me start with something everyone can relate to: dreams. When we sleep and dream, we often encounter people we know. We have conversations with them. We see them clearly. We hear their voices. These dream encounters feel completely real while we're experiencing them. But think about what's actually happening. When you dream about talking to someone, are you really hearing their voice? Is there actual sound, actual vibrations of air hitting your eardrums? Of course not. You're asleep in a quiet room. There's no sound being produced. What you're experiencing is a mental projection of sound. Your brain is creating the experience of hearing a voice without any actual acoustic sound being present. It's generating the sensation of sound purely through neural activity. And it's so convincing, so realistic, that while you're dreaming you cannot tell the difference between this mentally projected sound and real sound produced by vibrations in the air. The same is true for all sensory experiences in dreams. When you see someone in a dream, you're not actually seeing them with your eyes. Your eyes are closed. No light is hitting your retinas. Instead, your brain is creating a visual experience, a mental projection of sight that is just as vivid and convincing as actual vision. We do this all the time without thinking about it. We accept that in dreams, our consciousness can create fully convincing sensory experiences without any actual sensory input. We can see without eyes, hear without ears, touch without physical contact, all through the power of mental projection. Now here's where it gets interesting. What if the same mechanism that allows us to experience things in dreams also allows us to perceive spirits and communicate with the deceased? What if when we see a ghost, we're not actually seeing a physical or semi-physical entity, but rather we're receiving information from the consciousness of someone who has died, and our brain is translating that information into a visual experience through mental projection? This would explain so many things about how ghosts appear and behave. It would explain why different people sometimes see the same ghost differently. It would explain why ghosts can appear and disappear instantly, walk through walls, change their appearance. They're not bound by physical laws because they're not actually physical. They're mental projections created by our consciousness in response to information we're receiving from another consciousness. This understanding came to me gradually through my work filming people who were accessing their deceased loved ones. I've spent years documenting these encounters, studying the patterns, trying to understand the mechanics of how communication with the dead actually works. And one of the most fascinating patterns I noticed was how deceased people choose to appear to their loved ones. When someone who has died appears to a living person, whether in a dream, during hypnosis, through a medium, or in a direct encounter, they have complete control over how they look. And almost universally, they choose to appear as a younger, healthier version of themselves. Think about this for a moment. When a person appears in your dream, if that person has passed away, pay attention to how old they look. Are they the age they were when they died? If they died as an elderly person, do they appear elderly in your dream? Or do they appear younger, perhaps the age they were in their prime, when they felt best about themselves? In my research, I've found that deceased people almost always appear younger than their age at death. A grandmother who died at 85 might appear as she looked at 50 or 60. A man who died at 70 might appear as he looked at 40. They choose to present themselves at an age when they felt good, when they were healthy and vital. And it's not just age. Pay attention to what they're wearing when they appear to you. Is it something you remember them wearing in life? Is it the clothes they were buried in? Or is it something different? Perhaps something you've never seen before. In my documentation of these encounters, I've found that deceased people appear in all kinds of different outfits. Sometimes it's clothes they wore frequently when alive. Sometimes it's formal wear like a suit or dress. Sometimes it's casual clothing. Sometimes it's something the living person has never seen them wear. This is because the clothing, like the appearance itself, is part of the mental projection. The deceased person chooses how to present themselves based on what they think will be most comfortable and recognizable to the living person they're appearing to. It's an agreed-upon image, a visual representation that both consciousness can work with to facilitate communication. Let me give you a concrete example of this principle in action. This is the story I mentioned at the beginning about the nifty detective and his daughter. I was working on a film called Salt. For those who don't know, Salt is an action thriller that came out in 2010 starring Angelina Jolie. I was part of the production crew, and we were filming in New York City. Movie productions are intense, high-pressure environments with long hours and a lot of stress. During breaks or downtime, crew members often talk to pass the time, sharing stories and getting to know each other. During one of these breaks, a nip detective who was working as a consultant on the film pulled me aside. He had heard somehow that I had done research into the paranormal and communication with the deceased. He had a concerned, almost embarrassed look on his face, like he was about to tell me something he wasn't entirely comfortable discussing. "Can I talk to you about something weird that's been happening at my house?" he asked. I told him, of course, and we moved to a quieter area where we could talk privately. What he told me was both touching and fascinating, a perfect example of how the deceased choose to appear to their loved ones. The detective explained that his house was being haunted. But it wasn't a scary haunting like in horror movies. It was something much stranger and more specific. His 8-year-old daughter had been telling him for several weeks that there was a man in their kitchen every morning. A man who dressed like Daddy, in a police uniform. But it wasn't Daddy, because Daddy was getting ready for work in a different part of the house when the man appeared. At first, the detective had dismissed this as his daughter's imagination. Kids see things, make up stories, confuse dreams with reality. It's normal. But his daughter was very insistent and very specific. She described the man in detail. She said he was always in the same spot in the kitchen, standing near the refrigerator. She said he would smile at her, but never spoke. She said he looked like someone who worked with her daddy, because of the uniform. After hearing this same story multiple times, the detective started to take it more seriously. He asked his daughter more questions, trying to figure out if maybe she had seen someone outside their house, or if she was confusing a memory with current events. But she was adamant. There was a man in a police uniform in their kitchen every morning. So the detective decided to do something that turned out to be very revealing. He went through old photographs, pictures from his years on the force, and pulled out a photo of his former partner. This was a man he had worked with closely for several years. Someone he had been very close to both professionally and personally. The man had died 10 years earlier, killed in the line of duty. The detective showed this photograph to his daughter and asked if this was the man she was seeing in the kitchen. He didn't tell her who it was or give her any context. He just showed her the photo and asked if this looked like the man. His daughter looked at the photograph carefully and then said something that made the detective's blood run cold. She said, "That's him, Daddy, but he's thinner and has hair now." Let me explain why this was so significant. In the photograph, the detective's partner was shown near the end of his life, shortly before he died. He had put on weight over the years, as many police officers do from the stress of the job and the irregular eating schedule. He had also lost most of his hair, going bald as he aged. In the photograph, he was a heavy-set, bald man in his 50s. But the man the daughter was seeing in the kitchen every morning was a thinner version with a full head of hair. In other words, the deceased partner was appearing to this little girl as a younger, healthier version of himself. Probably as he looked in his 20s or 30s before the weight gain and hair loss. The detective was shaken by this. He came to me asking how this was possible. Was his house haunted? Was his daughter in danger? What did it mean that his dead partner was appearing in his kitchen? I could see the concern and confusion on his face. This was a practical man, a police detective who dealt in facts and evidence. The idea that his deceased partner might be haunting his house was deeply unsettling to him. But I had a different perspective based on my research. So I asked him a question. "Did you like this guy, your former partner?" The detective looked at me and said flatly, without hesitation, "I loved him." This answer told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a haunting in the traditional scary sense. This was something much more benign and actually quite beautiful. I explained to the detective what I believed was happening based on the research I had done. Your former partner who died 10 years ago is hanging around your kitchen, keeping an eye on your daughter while you're at work. Does that sound like a haunting to you? The detective was quiet for a moment, processing this reframing of the situation. "Not when you put it that way," he finally said. And that was exactly the point. We use the word haunting, and it comes loaded with all these negative connotations. We think of horror movies and malevolent spirits, and people being terrorized in their own homes. But what if most of what we call hauntings are actually just deceased loved ones checking in on the people they cared about? The detective's partner had loved him. They had been close, working together every day, trusting each other with their lives. That kind of bond doesn't just disappear when one person dies. The consciousness that was the detective's partner still cared about his former friend, still wanted to stay connected, still wanted to help and protect. And what better way to do that than to keep an eye on the detective's daughter while the detective was at work? The partner was acting as an invisible guardian, a protective presence in the house. The daughter could see him because children are often more open to perceiving these mental projections than adults are. Their filters aren't as strong. Their skepticism hasn't hardened into an impenetrable barrier. And the partner chose to appear as a younger, healthier version of himself for several reasons. First, because that's probably how he thought of himself. Our self-image isn't usually based on how we look in our final years. It's based on how we looked when we felt our best, when we were in our prime. The partner's consciousness still identified with his younger self, so that's the form the mental projection took. Second, appearing younger and healthier might have been a way of communicating that he was okay, that death hadn't diminished him but had actually restored him to a better state. It was a message of reassurance. Third, the younger version might have been more recognizable to the detective if the detective had primarily known him when he was younger. The mental projection was creating an image that would be familiar and identifiable. The detective seemed relieved by this explanation. The idea that his beloved former partner was acting as a guardian for his daughter was comforting rather than frightening. It transformed the experience from something potentially threatening into something protective and loving. This encounter on the film set perfectly illustrated the principles I had been discovering through my research. Deceased people don't appear as they were at death. They appear as they choose to appear, creating a mental projection that serves the purpose of communication and recognition. I've documented countless examples of this phenomenon. I've filmed people under hypnosis accessing memories of deceased relatives, and those relatives appear at various ages, wearing various outfits, presenting themselves in ways that are meaningful to the living person. I've watched mediums relay messages from the deceased, and the descriptions they give are almost never of the person as they were at death. Instead, they describe younger, healthier versions. The grandmother who died with dementia appears clear-minded and vital. The uncle who died of cancer appears healthy and whole. The friend who died in an accident appears uninjured and at peace. This makes perfect sense when you understand that these appearances are mental projections, rather than physical manifestations. The deceased person's consciousness is choosing how to present itself, and naturally it chooses a form that represents how they want to be remembered and how they currently perceive themselves. There's also the question of what happens to our consciousness after death, and how that affects how we appear to the living. Based on the research and the patterns I've observed, it seems that when we die, we're freed from the limitations and degradations of our physical bodies. We're no longer constrained by age, illness, injury, or physical decline. Our consciousness returns to a more idealized version of itself, often appearing as we were in our prime years. This isn't just wishful thinking or vanity. It's a natural state of consciousness unburdened by physical decay. When you're no longer limited by a failing body, you can present yourself as you truly feel you are, as you were when you felt most fully yourself. This understanding has profound implications for how we think about death and what comes after. It suggests that death is not an ending but a transformation, a shedding of physical limitations and a return to a purer state of consciousness. It suggests that we maintain our identity, our memories, our love for the people we left behind. And it suggests that we have continued agency, continued ability to interact with the living world, even if only through these mental projections. The mechanism by which this works is still something I'm trying to understand fully. How exactly does a consciousness that no longer has a physical brain manage to project information into the consciousness of a living person? How does the living person's brain translate that information into a visual or auditory experience? My current theory, based on the research, is that consciousness is not actually produced by the brain. The brain is more like a receiver or translator of consciousness rather than the source of it. Consciousness exists independently, and while we're alive, our brain filters and focuses that consciousness into the experience of being a particular individual with particular perceptions and thoughts. When the brain dies, consciousness doesn't die with it. It continues to exist, freed from the filtering and focusing function of the physical brain. This consciousness can then interact with other consciousnesses, including those of living people, whose brains are still functioning. When this interaction occurs, the living person's brain receives information from the deceased person's consciousness and translates it into sensory experiences, mental projections of sight and sound, and sometimes even touch and smell. These projections are so convincing that the living person perceives them as real, external phenomena rather than internal mental events. This would explain why ghosts can do things that violate physical laws. They can appear and disappear instantly because they're not actually moving through physical space. They're mental projections that can be turned on and off as easily as a thought. They can walk through walls because there are no actual walls in the mental space where these projections exist. They can change their appearance at will because appearance is just another aspect of the mental projection that can be modified. It would also explain why different people sometimes perceive the same ghost differently. They're each creating their own mental projection based on the information they're receiving from the deceased person's consciousness, filtered through their own expectations and beliefs and mental frameworks. The core information is the same, but the translation into sensory experience can vary. All of this brings me back to the detective and his daughter and the deceased partner appearing in the kitchen. The partner's consciousness was still connected to the detective through love and loyalty. That consciousness was choosing to maintain a presence in the detective's life, specifically to watch over his daughter. The daughter, being young and open, was able to perceive the mental projection that the partner's consciousness was generating. She saw him not as he was when he died, but as he chose to appear, younger and healthier and happier. This wasn't a haunting, it was a blessing. It was a deceased loved one continuing to care for and protect the people he had cared about in life. And once the detective understood this, he was no longer afraid or disturbed. He was grateful. I've seen this pattern repeated in countless cases. The deceased mother who appears to her adult daughter during times of stress, offering comfort and guidance. The deceased father who appears to his son at important moments, showing pride and support. The deceased spouse who appears to the surviving partner, communicating love and reassurance that they're still connected. These aren't hauntings in the horror movie sense. They're continued relationships, maintained across the boundary between life and death through the mechanism of mental projection and consciousness to consciousness communication. Of course, not all paranormal encounters are this benign. There are cases of genuinely negative or frightening presences, but I believe many of these can also be explained through the mental projection framework. Sometimes living people project their own fears and anxieties, creating frightening mental images that they then perceive as external threats. Sometimes negative entities exist, consciousnesses that have hostile or malevolent intent and project threatening images to feed on the fear they create. But the vast majority of encounters with the deceased, in my experience and research, are positive or at least neutral. They're deceased people checking in on loved ones, offering protection or comfort, or simply maintaining a connection to the world and people they knew and loved. Understanding this changes everything about how we approach the paranormal. Instead of being frightened of ghosts and spirits, we can recognize them as continued connections with people we've loved and lost. Instead of trying to banish or avoid them, we can welcome them and appreciate the comfort and protection they offer. For the detective, this reframing was transformative. Instead of worrying that his house was haunted, he could take comfort in knowing that his beloved former partner was still watching over his family. Instead of being concerned about his daughter seeing a ghost, he could appreciate that she was sensitive enough to perceive this protective presence. The last thing the detective asked me before we ended our conversation was whether he should tell his daughter who the man in the kitchen really was. I suggested that he do so, explaining in age-appropriate terms that the man was Daddy's friend, who had died, but still cared about their family and wanted to make sure they were safe. Children can usually handle this kind of information better than adults expect, especially when it's framed positively. I don't know if the detective followed my advice or how his daughter reacted if he did, but I hope that conversation helped him see his situation in a new light. transforming fear into gratitude and confusion into understanding. This is the power of understanding how we actually perceive and communicate with the deceased. When we recognize that what we're seeing is a mental projection, an agreed-upon image created through consciousness to consciousness interaction, everything becomes clearer. The deceased can appear however they choose. They can update their appearance, showing themselves younger or healthier or happier. They can wear different clothes, present different aspects of their personality, adapt their presentation to what will be most comforting or recognizable to the living person. And the living person, whether consciously or unconsciously, participates in creating this mental projection, translating the information they're receiving from the deceased consciousness into a visual and auditory experience that makes sense within their own mental framework. It's a collaborative process, a meeting of minds across the boundary of death, facilitated by the same mechanism that allows us to see and hear and experience things in our dreams. Mental projection. The power of consciousness to create convincing sensory experiences without requiring actual sensory input. This understanding has brought me great comfort as I've dealt with my own losses over the years. When I've had dreams of deceased loved ones, or fleeting perceptions of their presence, I don't dismiss these as mere imagination or wishful thinking. I recognize them as genuine communication, as mental projections created through the continued connection between my consciousness and theirs. And I pay attention to how they appear in these encounters, not as they were when they died, diminished by age or illness, but as they choose to appear, vital and whole and at peace. Thinner with more hair, as the detective's partner appeared. Younger and healthier, as countless deceased people have appeared to their loved ones. Happy and at peace, showing that whatever lies beyond death is not something to fear, but something to embrace. This is the truth about ghosts and spirits that most people don't understand. They're not creepy, threatening entities from horror movies. They're not bound to the locations where they died or trapped in some tortured state. They're consciousnesses that have survived death, maintaining their identity and their connections to the people they loved, and choosing to appear to those people in forms that communicate love and reassurance and continued care. The ghost in the kitchen wasn't haunting the detective's house. He was protecting the detective's daughter, standing guard while her father was at work. A final act of service from a partner who had always had his friend's back. And he appeared not as he was when he died, but as he wanted to be seen, younger and thinner, and full of life, showing that death had freed him rather than diminished him. That's the real story of most hauntings. Not horror, but love. Not fear, but comfort. Not endings, but continued connections that transcend the boundary between life and death, and all of it made possible through the mysterious and beautiful mechanism of mental projection, the same power that allows us to see and hear and experience our loved ones in dreams, now allowing us to perceive them in our waking world as well. Understanding this changes everything, and I hope that sharing this understanding helps others find peace and comfort in their own encounters with the deceased. Recognizing them not as threats, but as blessings. Not as hauntings, but as continued relationships with people who love us still. Next one story start now. The gift I never asked for. My bedroom was completely dark, completely quiet, and I was only 3 years old when something came through the wall. Not through the door, not through the window, through the solid wall. I still think about that night more than I probably should. Decades have passed since then, and I have lived through enough strange moments in my life to fill several notebooks. But that first night, that very first time, sits in a category all by itself. Because I was just a baby, really. Barely old enough to form sentences. Barely old enough to understand what fear was, let alone what was causing it. And yet somehow, somewhere deep in the part of me that exists before language, and before reason, I knew exactly what I was looking at, and I knew that it had no business being there. I want to tell you this story the way it actually happened. Not dressed up, not exaggerated, not turned into something spooky for the sake of telling a good story. I want to tell it plainly and honestly, the way you would tell a friend something that changed you forever, sitting across from them at a table with your hands wrapped around a warm cup of something, your voice low, your eyes steady, meaning every single word. Because this is not fiction. This happened to me, and it has been happening to me ever since. Let me start from the very beginning, before the apparition, before the crying, before my mother came rushing in from the next room. Let me start with the apartment, and the night, and the way the world felt in those hours just before everything changed. We lived in a small apartment on the first floor up, which meant we were technically elevated from the street, but not by much. Just enough to feel like you were slightly removed from the world outside, slightly insulated from the noise and the light and the movement of everything happening below. My parents had chosen the apartment for practical reasons, the way young parents always do. It was affordable, it was close to things they needed, and it had enough rooms to give their growing family a little breathing space. My room was just next door to my parents' master bedroom. I mean directly next door, with a shared wall between us that was thin enough to hear muffled sounds on the other side. I took comfort in that, the way small children do. Knowing that my parents were just one wall away made the darkness feel less heavy. It made the nighttime feel less like something to be afraid of. My infant brother slept in a crib beside my bed. He had not been with us for very long at that point, still brand new in the way that babies are. Still adjusting to the world outside the womb. He slept the way babies sleep, deeply and completely, as if nothing in the universe could touch him. And that night, he was absolutely silent. Not a single sound from his direction. The windows in my room were covered by thick, heavy drapes. My parents had put them up to block out the streetlights and the headlights from the traffic that came and went on the road below. Our apartment sat at a particular angle where the lights from a distant intersection, perched at the crest of a hill, would shine directly into the room if the curtains were not drawn. Those lights could be surprisingly intense, sweeping across the ceiling and walls at odd hours, interrupting sleep in that disorienting way where you are not quite sure if you are dreaming or awake. So the drapes stayed closed. The room stayed dark. That was the setting. A dark room. A sleeping baby. Thick curtains blocking the outside world. A wall connecting my room to my parents'. And a little child, not yet 4 years old, asleep in bed. And then I was not asleep anymore. I cannot tell you exactly what woke me. There was no noise that I can remember, no sudden sound that pulled me out of sleep. It was something more internal than that, more like a shift in the atmosphere of the room, a change in the quality of the air itself. If you have ever had that experience of waking up and immediately knowing that something is different, not wrong exactly, just different, then you have some small idea of what I mean. It was that feeling, magnified by about 1,000, filtered through the awareness of a very small child who had no framework whatsoever for understanding what she was sensing. I woke up with angst. That is the word that has always stuck with me when I try to describe it. Not fear, exactly. At least not at first. More like a deep unease. A feeling that something required my attention. My eyes were sharp the way your eyes get when you have just come out of deep sleep in a dark room, adjusted fully to the blackness around you, picking up on every small variation in the dark. I remember looking around my room. Not casually, not the way you might glance around before falling back to sleep. I mean really looking. The way you look at something when part of you already suspects what you might find. My eyes moved across the darkness slowly, taking in the familiar shapes of furniture. the outline of my brother's crib, the heavy mass of the drapes against the windows. And then I saw it come through the wall. It came through the wall that separated my bedroom from my parents' bedroom. The solid wall. It did not come from the door. It did not come from the window. It emerged directly from the wall itself, several feet off the floor, glowing with a light that had no source, no explanation, and absolutely no place being inside a dark apartment in the middle of the night. The fright that hit me was not like anything I had ever felt before, or have felt since, in quite the same way. It was total and immediate, the kind of fear that shuts everything down. I was frozen. Completely, utterly, impossibly frozen. My body stopped taking orders from whatever part of my brain was screaming at it to move. I could not scream. I could not run. I could not even turn my head away. I was locked in place, a tiny child in a dark room, absolutely paralyzed by what I was seeing. And I was seeing everything. The figure was glowing. Not brightly, not like a light bulb or a lamp, but with a soft, steady luminescence that was entirely its own. It lit up the space around it just enough to throw the room into a strange, half-visible clarity. And here is the thing I have never been able to forget, even all these years later. Even though I cannot clearly recall the details of the figure itself, I can still see the drapes, the heavy curtains on my windows, the thick ones my parents had hung specifically to keep all outside light from coming in, were being lit up from inside the room. From the light the figure was giving off, I could see the floral pattern on those drapes, flowers and leaves, and the swirling design of the fabric, all of it illuminated by the glow of something that should not have been there. That detail has never left me. Of everything from that night, that image is the most persistent. The flowers on those curtains lit up in the dark. The figure appeared feminine. I understood that even at 3 years old, in the way that children understand things before they have the vocabulary to explain them. It was wearing something that flowed, some kind of garment that moved with it in a way that defied the physics of how clothes actually behave. The closest comparison I have ever found for that movement is this. Imagine a dress being worn underwater. That slow, weightless, billowing quality, the fabric drifting and flaring with each movement as if it existed in a different relationship with gravity than the rest of the world. That is exactly how it looked. It moved around my room. I do not know for how long. Time does something strange in moments of extreme fear, particularly for a child. Particularly for a child in the dark. It could have been 30 seconds. It could have been 5 minutes. I have no reliable way of measuring it. I only know that it moved, that it drifted and floated and turned, and that the whole time it was present in that room, I was unable to do anything except watch it. And then it was gone. As suddenly as it had appeared, as completely as it had materialized out of nothing, it simply vanished. One moment it was there. The next moment the room was dark again, the curtains still, my brother still sleeping in his crib, and me alone in the sudden ordinary silence. That was when the scream finally came. It came from somewhere so deep, and so desperate, that it surprised even me. A full, bellowing cry. The kind of cry that only small children can produce. Because only small children have that particular combination of complete terror, and no filter between the feeling and the sound. I let out everything I had been holding in during those frozen minutes. All the paralysis and the fear and the shock. All of it released in that one enormous cry. My mother was in my room almost immediately. I remember her coming in the way parents do, moving fast and sure in the way of someone who has rehearsed emergency even in their sleep. She went to me immediately, gathered me up, held me close. She was doing all the things a mother does to calm a frightened child in the night. And I remember trying to tell her. I remember the desperation of trying to put into words what I had just experienced. to communicate to her the enormity of what I had seen, and having nothing, almost nothing, to work with. The words were simply not there yet. I was too young. The vocabulary did not exist in me. I could cry, and I could point, and I could make sounds that approximated the urgency of what I needed her to understand. But the full story was beyond me. What I remember most clearly from those moments after, beyond the comfort of being held, was my mother's face. She did not look the way I might have expected. She did not look confused or dismissive or gently amused the way parents sometimes look when small children cry about shadows or dreams. She looked like someone who understood exactly what had happened. She looked, more than anything else, like someone who had been expecting this. I could not have explained that observation at 3 years old. But I felt it. Children feel things in adults that they cannot name, and what I felt in my mother in those moments was a kind of grave, knowing recognition. She soothed me back to sleep eventually, the way mothers do. The apartment went quiet again. The night continued, but nothing was the same after that. Even at 3 years old, I understood that something had shifted. Years passed. Many years. I grew up, as children do, gaining language and experience and the particular kind of skepticism that the world builds into you over time. I thought about that night often. The way you think about something that lodged itself in you before you were old enough to properly process it. I questioned it constantly. Memory is not reliable, especially early childhood memory, especially for something that happened in the dark and in a state of fear. I turned it over and over in my mind, looking for the rational explanation. The dream, the play of light through curtains, the fever hallucination. Anything that could account for what I remembered seeing. I could never find a satisfying one, but I kept looking, partly because the world does not encourage you to take experiences like that seriously, and partly because I had no way of verifying what I had experienced. I had no witness. I had been alone in that room, alone except for a sleeping infant who could not speak, and a memory that was just old enough to hold on to the shapes of things without the sharp edges of certainty. Or so I thought. It was much later in my life, years and years after that night, that my mother sat me down and told me something that rearranged everything. She told me that she had seen it too. She had been in her own bedroom that night, the master bedroom on the other side of that shared wall, when the same figure appeared to her. The same glowing, feminine shape. The same flowing garment moving in that slow, underwater way. She had watched it in her own room before it passed through the wall. Through the wall into my room. She had been lying in bed, aware of it, watching it, when she heard my cry come from the other side. And in that moment, she told me, she knew two things simultaneously. She knew what I had seen, and she knew that I was going to be like her. She had always known, she said. She had always sensed it in me, the way you sense something that is a reflection of yourself. But she had not had confirmation until that night. Hearing me cry at that precise moment, knowing what was on the other side of that wall, she understood that the apparition had moved from her room to mine, because I could see it, because I was capable of seeing it, because whatever this thing was, whatever these experiences are, they do not come to everyone. They come to certain people. And that night, they came to both of us. I want to take a moment here to talk about my mother, because she is central to all of this, not just as a parent who came when I cried, but as the person who gave me the most important framework I have ever had for understanding my own experiences. My mother has always been clairvoyant. I say that without hesitation or embarrassment, because I have spent my entire life watching it. She has known things she had no way of knowing. She has sensed things before they happened. She has had moments of awareness that cannot be explained by coincidence or intuition alone. Moments that were too specific, too accurate, too perfectly timed to be anything other than what they appeared to be. I grew up watching her navigate the world with this extra layer of awareness that most people around her did not have. She never made a performance of it. She was not dramatic about it or theatrical. It was simply part of how she experienced reality. The way some people are able to hear frequencies that others cannot. The way some people can smell things others walk right past. She had a sense that extended beyond the ordinary, and she lived with it quietly and carried it with great care. Knowing that about her, knowing the history of what she had experienced throughout her life, and what she had seen with her own eyes, changed everything about the weight I gave to her confirmation. This was not a woman who was telling me what I wanted to hear. This was not a mother trying to validate her child's scary dream. This was a woman who had spent decades navigating her own experiences with the paranormal, who understood better than almost anyone what it meant to see something that the world would tell you is impossible, and who was now telling me, with complete calm and complete certainty, that what I had experienced as a child was real. That what she had experienced in her room that same night was real. That we had both seen the same thing. I have no words for what that confirmation did to me. There is something uniquely destabilizing about having a childhood memory that you have spent years quietly doubting suddenly verified by another witness. Especially when that witness is someone you trust completely. Especially when that witness was in the next room. Especially when that witness tells you that the thing you saw came from where they were before it came to you. After that conversation with my mother, I stopped trying to explain away that night. I stopped holding it at arm's length, looking for the dream or the fever or the trick of light. I accepted it for what it was. I accepted that when I was 3 years old, something passed through a wall into my room. Something that glowed and moved and wore a flowing garment and had no explanation that the ordinary world could provide. I accepted that my mother saw it first. I accepted that it found me because I was capable of being found. And I accepted that this was not the end of the story. Not by a long way. Because that night was only the first time. I have had experiences throughout my life that I could spend much more time describing. Each one different. Each one adding another piece to something I am still not entirely sure how to name. Some of them have frightened me. Some of them have felt almost comforting in a strange way that is difficult to explain. Some of them have been small, a presence felt in an empty room. A sense of being watched by something benign. A dream that was too specific and too accurate to be only a dream. And some of them have been significant, undeniable, the kind of experience that you know even as it is happening will stay with you forever. I have questioned all of them. I want to be clear about that. I have never been the kind of person who accepts these things easily or without scrutiny. I have always pushed back against my own experiences. Always looked for the rational explanation first. Always tried to give the ordinary world a full and fair chance to account for what I was experiencing. I think that skepticism is actually important. I think it is part of what makes genuine experiences, the ones that survive all the scrutiny, so significant. Because when you have tried every other explanation and nothing fits, when you have been honest with yourself about every possible way you could be wrong, and you still come back to the same conclusion, you have to take that conclusion seriously. My mother taught me that. She lived her whole life that way, not credulously, not jumping to extraordinary explanations out of a desire for them to be true, but honestly, with rigor. With the understanding that the world contains things that cannot be accounted for by the narrow set of explanations most people are comfortable with. She also taught me something else, something that took me a long time to fully absorb. She taught me that having these experiences is not something to be afraid of. Not exactly. It is something to be respected, to be taken seriously, to be handled with care. but not feared. The fear, she always said, comes from not understanding what you are dealing with. And while we may never fully understand it, getting comfortable with not understanding is itself a kind of peace. I think about the apparition from that first night often, even now. I think about the way it moved, that slow underwater drift of the garment. I think about the flowers on my curtains lit up from the inside. I think about my brother sleeping through all of it completely undisturbed. And what it means that some people can sleep through something like that while others are frozen in place watching it. I think about the wall it came through, and the fact that on the other side of that wall, my mother was awake and watching the same thing, and that she knew when it passed through to me, because she heard my cry. There is a kind of intimacy in that shared experience that I find difficult to put into words. Two people, mother and child, separated by a single wall, both witnesses to the same impossible thing. One of them old enough to understand what she was seeing and carry it quietly through the years. One of them too young to do anything but cry. And years later, sitting together, comparing what they saw and finding that the details matched. That is the part that gets me, every single time. The details matched, not because one of us influenced the other. Not because we had told each other the story so many times that it had blurred together, but because we had genuinely, independently experienced the same event from different sides of a wall. And the experience had been consistent in its details. I do not know who the apparition was. I do not know why she appeared to us that night, or what she was doing, or what her presence meant. I have wondered, over the years, whether she was connected to the apartment, to the building, to a specific person in our family, or to something else entirely. I have not been able to answer that question, and I have made my peace with the not knowing. What I do know is this. I was 3 years old in a dark bedroom, and something came through the wall. It glowed. It wore something that moved like a dress in water. It moved around my room, and then it vanished. And when I cried, my mother came, and she already knew what I had seen. I know that my mother had the same gift her whole life, and that she recognized it in me from that night forward. I know that I have had experiences throughout my life that have confirmed, again and again, that whatever this is, it did not leave me. I know that I have spent years questioning those experiences, and that the questioning has never produced a better explanation than the one I am left with when I stop fighting it. Something is there. Some part of the world is there that most people do not see. And some of us, for reasons we may never fully understand, are built to see it whether we ask to be or not. I was 3 years old the first time. I did not ask for it. I did not invite it. I was just a small child in a dark room, newly awakened from sleep, looking around because something told me to look. And what I found when I looked changed the entire course of how I understood the world I was living in. I have never stopped looking since, not because I am searching for something to believe in, but because I have no choice. Because whatever this is, it does not require my belief. It does not need my permission. It shows up when it shows up, on its own terms, in its own time. And the best I can do, the best any of us can do who carry this kind of awareness, is what my mother did when she heard her child crying in the next room. Walk toward it. Go into the dark. And be honest about what you find there. That is where this story begins. Not where it ends. Next one story, start now. It was 3 a.m. when my dog lost his mind. That is the only way I know how to describe it. One moment the house was completely quiet, the way a house gets at that hour when everyone inside it has been asleep long enough for the whole place to settle into a deep, heavy stillness. The kind of quiet where you can hear the refrigerator humming from 2 rooms away. The kind of quiet where the world outside feels like it has been put on pause. And then, cutting straight through all of that, came the sound of my dog barking with everything he had. Not the casual, half-hearted bark he used when a car drove past the house, or when the neighbors got home late. Not the short, sharp warning sound he made when something mildly interesting crossed his radar. This was different. This was the sound of an animal that was genuinely alarmed, fully committed to communicating that something was very wrong, and absolutely not interested in stopping until someone paid attention. I was out of bed before I was fully awake. That is the thing about that kind of barking. It bypasses whatever part of your brain normally takes a few minutes to get going in the morning, and goes straight to the part that moves your body without waiting for permission. I was on my feet, moving down the hallway, heart already going faster than it had any right to at that hour, before I had properly processed what was happening, or where I was going. I found him in the kitchen. He was standing in front of the door that led to the basement, and he was absolutely frantic. Not just barking, but throwing his whole body into it, jumping against the door, scratching at the frame, turning in tight circles and then launching himself at the door again. His focus was completely locked on whatever was on the other side. He was not looking at me, not acknowledging that I had come, not doing any of the things dogs do when they want your attention and then immediately redirect to something else once they have it. He was in another world entirely, a world that existed only on the other side of that basement door, and nothing I said or did was pulling him out of it. I stood there in the kitchen for a moment, barefoot on the cold tile, wearing nothing but a t-shirt, looking at my dog, and then looking at the door and trying to think through what I was actually dealing with here. The basement door had a small window at the top, one of those narrow, rectangular panes set into the upper portion of the door that lets you see a sliver of whatever was on the other side before you committed to opening it. I leaned forward and peered through it. I could not see anything. The basement was dark, and the window was small, and from the angle I was standing at I could only see a limited portion of what was down there. No obvious movement. No shapes that seemed out of place in the thin strip of visibility I had. Nothing that immediately explained why my dog was behaving like the entire underworld had taken up residence below my house. But here is the thing about a dog going that crazy at 3 in the morning. Rationally, you can tell yourself that you looked through the window and did not see anything, and therefore, everything is probably fine. You can say those words to yourself very clearly and mean them completely, and your body will still be doing its own separate calculation, the one that runs underneath rational thought, and has been running since long before humans developed the capacity for rational thought, and that calculation will be producing a very different result. Something was down there. My dog knew it, and my body knew it even when my eyes could not confirm it. I had 2 options. I could go back to bed, leave the basement alone, deal with it in the morning when there was daylight, and I was wearing more than a t-shirt, and my heart rate was somewhere in the normal range. Or I could open that door and go see what my dog was so worked up about. I opened the door. This is the part where people who hear this story always pause and look at me the same way, like they are trying to figure out whether I was brave or just not thinking clearly. And honestly, standing there in that kitchen at 3 in the morning, I am not sure there was much of a distinction. I was not making a calculated decision about risk. I was just doing what felt like the obvious next step. The way you do when adrenaline has your system running, and something in you has already decided that the not knowing is worse than whatever the knowing might turn out to be. I managed to get the door open and slip through it, and get it closed again behind me before my dog could squeeze through with me. That took a little maneuvering because he was absolutely determined to be part of whatever was happening, but I got it done. The door clicked shut, and I was standing at the top of the basement stairs, Alone, with only the darkness below me, and the sound of my dog still barking and scratching on the other side of the door at my back. The first thing I did was try the door handle that led from the basement to the back patio. This was important. If something had gotten into the basement from outside, then that door was the most obvious entry point, and if it was unlocked, or had been forced open, that would tell me immediately what I was dealing with. I crossed to it and tried the handle. Locked. Still locked, solid and unmoved, exactly as it should have been. I felt a portion of the tension in my chest ease off slightly. Not completely, but enough to take a breath. If the back door was locked, then whatever was in the basement had not come in from outside through that entrance. That narrowed things down, at least a little. It was something, in a situation where I was working with very little information and a nervous system that was running about 3 times faster than usual. I reached for the light switch and flipped it on. And then I stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at what the light revealed. And for the second time in the span of about 5 minutes, I completely froze. 2 pairs of eyes looked back up at me, round, masked, absolutely unblinking. There was a large raccoon sitting on top of a dresser I kept at the far end of the basement. And I mean large. This was not a young, slight, recently independent animal finding its way in the world. This was a fully grown, extremely well-fed raccoon that had clearly been living a comfortable life and making excellent dietary choices for some time. It was sitting there, with the particular kind of settled confidence that belongs only to creatures who believe, with complete justification, that they are exactly where they are supposed to be. In front of it, on top of the dresser, was the bowl I kept down there for my cat. The bowl that had been full of cat food when I went to bed. The raccoon was eating from it with an air of tremendous satisfaction, pausing to look up at me the way you might look up at someone who has just walked into a restaurant and interrupted your meal by standing in the doorway staring at you. The second raccoon, smaller than the first and perched on top of a bookcase against the wall, was watching me with an expression that I can only describe as cautiously curious. It had stopped whatever it had been doing and was giving me its full attention. Not in a panicked way, not in a way that suggested it was about to bolt, but in the measured, considering way of an animal that is trying to decide what category of problem I fell into and whether I required an immediate response. I did not move. They did not move. For what felt like a long stretch of time, but was probably only a few seconds, all 3 of us just stayed exactly where we were and looked at each other across the length of that basement. And then the situation clarified itself in my mind in a way that almost made me want to laugh. Except that laughing would have required relaxing muscles that were still very much in a state of high alert. The doggy door. I had a doggy door in the basement. A panel cut into the wall at ground level that gave my dog access to the outside yard. And I had completely forgotten, at some point recently, to put the panel back in after letting him out. I had left it open. I had left the basement accessible from the outside, at ground level, with an opening just large enough for a motivated animal to squeeze through. And at some point during the night, these 2 had found it, investigated it, squeezed through it, made their way into my basement, discovered a bowl of cat food that must have seemed like the most extraordinary stroke of luck, and settled in to make the most of the situation. From their perspective, I realized this had probably been a genuinely excellent night right up until the moment I appeared at the top of the stairs and started flooding everything with light. Now, I need to stop here and tell you something about raccoons, because if you have never had a close encounter with one, you might have the impression that they are the kind of animals you can simply reason with, or shoo away, or handle as a minor inconvenience. You might be imagining something relatively small and ultimately harmless, and you might be thinking that my freezing on the staircase was a somewhat dramatic response to a not very dangerous situation. Let me correct that impression. A fully grown adult raccoon can weigh anywhere up to 30 pounds and sometimes more. They have hands, essentially, Dexterous little fingers that can open latches and turn handles and get into things that you would not believe an animal could get into. Their teeth are serious. Their claws are serious. And when a raccoon feels threatened or cornered, it becomes a completely different proposition from the slightly comical masked bandit of popular imagination. A cornered raccoon is a fast, strong, genuinely dangerous animal that can do real damage to a person in a very short amount of time. I was barefoot. I was wearing a t-shirt. I was standing at the foot of a staircase with my back to the only exit, in an enclosed space with 2 raccoons between me and the doggy door, and the larger of them was the size of a very solid, very healthy cat. The rational move. The move that basically every person I have told this story to has said they would have made, was to back up the stairs slowly, go back through the basement door, close it behind me, and call someone in the morning who had the proper equipment and training to deal with this situation. Animal control existed for exactly this kind of thing. There were people whose entire job was handling wildlife that had found its way into human spaces. I did not need to be the person who resolved this at 3 in the morning in my bare feet. I did not do the rational thing. What I did instead came out of me the way things do when you are running on adrenaline, and your thinking brain has partially stepped aside to let something more instinctive take the wheel. It was not a plan. It was not a strategy. It was not the result of any process of weighing options and selecting the best course of action. It was just what came out of me when I looked at those 2 raccoons in my basement, and felt the particular exasperation of someone who has been woken up at 3 in the morning, and would very much like to go back to bed. I clapped my hands together, loud and sharp, and I said, in the clearest and most no-nonsense voice I possessed at that hour, out. Get out. Now. I want to be honest with you about my expectations in that moment, which were essentially non-existent. I was not expecting obedience. I was not expecting those raccoons to look at me and think, yes, this human makes a compelling point, and we should honor her request. I was operating on zero strategy and a lot of nerve, and the vague hope that making myself loud and large would at least cause them to move away from me rather than toward me, which felt like the minimum acceptable outcome. What actually happened was not the minimum acceptable outcome. What actually happened was something I have spent a lot of time since trying to adequately explain to people who were not there to see it. Both raccoons, without any apparent hesitation or deliberation, came down from where they were perched. The large one stepped off the dresser. The smaller one descended from the bookcase. And then, with a kind of purposeful, unhurried efficiency that I found almost more unsettling than if they had gone in any other direction, they both walked to the stairs. They climbed the stairs, past me. Right past me, close enough that I could have reached out and touched them, though I had no intention of doing so, and stood as still as I have ever stood in my life as they went by. They reached the doggy door, the one they had come in through, and without looking back, without any fuss, without any of the panic or scrambling that I might have expected from animals being expelled from a space at 3 in the morning, they went through it, and were gone. I stood in my basement alone, still at the foot of the stairs, my hands still half raised from the clap, and tried to understand what had just happened. They had listened to me. 2 wild raccoons, animals with no particular reason to pay any attention to anything a barefoot human in a t-shirt had to say, had heard me tell them to leave and had left. Calmly. Immediately. As if this were a completely reasonable thing that happened all the time. I was shaking. I did not realize how badly I was shaking until it was over and the adrenaline started to have nowhere to go. My hands were trembling. My knees felt uncertain in a way that made me want to sit down on the stairs, which I did, for a minute, just sitting there in the quiet basement, in the aftermath of one of the stranger 3 in the morning encounters of my life. Then I got up, crossed to the doggy door, picked up the panel that was leaning against the wall beside it, and pushed it firmly into the opening. I checked it twice to make sure it was fully seated. I stood there and looked at it for a moment, this simple piece of material that I had forgotten to put in place before going to bed. This small oversight that had turned into a raccoon situation at 3 in the morning. I checked the panel a third time. Then I went back up the stairs, through the basement door, and into the kitchen where my dog was waiting for me, still in a state of considerable agitation. He did not settle down quickly. Dogs process these things differently than people do, and he had been working himself into a genuine frenzy for however long those raccoons had been down there before I woke up. I sat with him on the kitchen floor for a while, one hand on his back, letting him gradually come back down from the alert state he had been in. His breathing slowed. His body relaxed by degrees. Eventually he lay down beside me on the tile, his head resting near my leg, his eyes still watchful, but no longer frantic. I sat there with him and thought about the night. I thought about how the whole thing had started with him. He had been the one who knew something was wrong. I had looked through that window in the basement door and seen nothing. And if I had relied only on my own observations, I might have gone back to bed telling myself it was probably nothing. But he had not been operating on what he could see through a small window. He had been operating on smell, on hearing, on the combination of senses that dogs use to read the world in ways that humans simply cannot replicate. He had known exactly what was down there, and he had been trying to tell me with everything he had. I thought about how often we dismiss that kind of communication from our animals. How often we hear the barking and think about how to stop it rather than stopping to really ask what it means. He had done his job that night completely and without any ambiguity. He had been loud and persistent and impossible to ignore. And he had led me straight to the situation that needed addressing. The only reason I knew what was in my basement was because he would not let me go back to sleep until I went and looked. I thought about the raccoons themselves too, about the large one sitting on the dresser eating cat food with that air of complete entitlement, and the smaller one watching from the bookcase with those round, masked eyes, about the way they had both looked at me when the light came on, not panicked, not aggressive, just watching me, taking stock of me, deciding how to categorize me. There had been a moment of genuine communication in that basement. A moment of 3 creatures assessing each other across a space and trying to figure out what the situation required. And I thought about what had happened when I clapped and told them to go. People, when I tell them that part, almost always laugh. Some of them laugh with me, sharing in the absurdity and the surprise of it. And some of them laugh at the image of me standing barefoot at the foot of my basement stairs, giving orders to raccoons at 3 in the morning. Which I fully understand and do not take personally. It is a genuinely ridiculous image, and I would probably laugh at it too if I were hearing it from someone else. But they also, almost universally, say some version of the same thing. That was foolish. That you could have been seriously hurt. That raccoons are not domestic animals and do not respond to human commands. And you had no way of knowing how they were going to react. And you were lucky that it went the way it did rather than the other way. And they are right. I know they are right. I am not standing here arguing that what I did was the smart play or the recommended approach to finding wildlife in your home in the middle of the night. Objectively, calmly, in the light of day, I can fully acknowledge that I made a choice that had a meaningful possibility of going badly, and that I was fortunate it did not. But I also cannot fully account for it as foolishness either. Because what I remember from that moment, standing at the foot of those stairs, is not recklessness. I do not remember feeling like I was throwing caution aside. I remember something that felt much more like clarity, like a specific direct understanding of what the moment required, and what would work. I cannot explain where that understanding came from. I cannot point to any experience or knowledge I had that should have told me that clapping and shouting would send two raccoons calmly back out the way they came. It was not logical. It was not informed. It was just, somehow, what came out. And it worked. I have had enough time since that night to think about the randomness of it, about all the ways it could have gone differently. If those raccoons had been younger and more skittish, the sudden noise and movement might have panicked them into going in every direction except toward the door. If the larger one had felt cornered or threatened, the result might have been a very different kind of encounter. One that ended with injuries instead of raccoons calmly filing out the door. If the smaller one had bolted somewhere other than toward the exit, the whole situation could have escalated into something that took much longer and involved much more chaos to resolve. The variables were not in my favor, objectively speaking. I was underdressed, undersized compared to two combined animals, with no tools, no protective clothing, no plan, and no expertise. I was standing in an enclosed space with two wild animals between me and the exit. The number of ways that situation could have gone wrong is honestly fairly long. And yet, they heard me. They came down from where they were. They walked past me on those stairs, close enough for me to feel the reality of their size and presence in a way that I will never forget. And they went through the door and out into the night without incident. I have told this story at dinner tables and on back porches, and in conversations that started somewhere else entirely, and somehow ended up here. I have told it to people who thought it was funny, people who thought it was scary, people who thought it was both, and people who spent most of the telling shaking their heads slowly like they were not sure what to do with any of it. Every single time, the response to the part where I clap and shout and the raccoons simply leave is some version of disbelief. They just went. They just went. As if I had asked them to and they had considered the request and found it reasonable. There is something almost funny about that even now. The image of it. Two raccoons, one of them enormous and clearly in the middle of a very enjoyable late-night meal, both of them completely undisturbed until I arrived and turned the lights on and made demands. And then both of them, without apparent objection, walking past me and leaving. Not fast, not panicked, just walking. Just going. As if 3 a.m. was a perfectly reasonable hour to wrap things up and head back outside. I did not sleep well for the rest of that night. That is probably not surprising. Even once I had handled the situation and secured the doggy door and settled my dog, and confirmed that the basement contained nothing except the things that were supposed to be in it. My body was still processing the adrenaline of being woken up suddenly and going downstairs and finding 2 sets of round masked eyes staring up at me. That does not just switch off because the immediate situation has been resolved. It takes time to work its way through your system, and so I lay in bed for a long while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle back into its normal nighttime sounds, waiting for my heart rate to stop reminding me of what had just happened. My dog lay on the floor beside the bed, which was not his usual spot. He normally slept on his own bed across the room. But that night he positioned himself right beside me and stayed there, and I did not argue with him about it. We had both had a night, and we both needed the company. In the morning everything looked ordinary again, the way everything always does in daylight after something strange in the dark. The basement was just a basement. The dresser where the large raccoon had been sitting looked exactly as it always did, except for the empty cat food bowl on top of it, which was perhaps the clearest evidence that the whole thing had actually happened, and was not some extraordinarily vivid 3 a.m. dream. The doggy door panel was firmly in place. The back door was still locked. I went through the basement more carefully in the daylight, looking for any other sign of what had visited during the night. There was some evidence of movement, a few things slightly out of place. The cat food bowl obviously disturbed, but nothing damaged. Nothing broken. Nothing that suggested the visit had been anything other than entirely focused on the food. They had come in, found the cat food, made themselves comfortable, and stayed until they were asked to leave. As intrusions go, it was not the worst. I refilled my cat's bowl and put it in a different location, up higher than before, somewhere it would not be accessible to a ground-level visitor. I made a mental note to talk to my cat about the company she was apparently drawing in, which was not a conversation I expected to be productive but felt necessary to have anyway. And then I went about the rest of my day, carrying the story with me the way you carry a story that you know is going to be worth telling. The real lesson, the one I took away from that night and have kept with me ever since, was not about raccoons. It was not even really about doggy doors, though the practical lesson about closing them before dark was one I implemented immediately and permanently without any further convincing required. The real lesson was about my dog. He had known. He had known before I was awake, before I had any idea anything was happening, before there was any possibility of me figuring it out on my own. He had positioned himself at exactly the right door and raised the alarm with everything he had, and refused to stop until I got up and went to see what he was telling me about. If he had been quieter, if he had been the kind of dog who barked a few times and gave up when no one responded, I might have slept through the whole thing and come downstairs in the morning to find an empty cat food bowl and no explanation for it. But he was not that kind of dog. He was the kind of dog who committed to the job until the job was done, and the job that night was making sure I knew what was in my basement. I have thought about that sometimes in the years since, about all the things our animals are paying attention to that we are not, about all the information they are processing and trying to communicate to us through the limited channels available to them, about how often we are looking through the small window in the door, seeing nothing from our narrow angle and deciding that nothing is there, while the creature beside us is reading the full picture with senses we do not have, and trying to get us to trust what they know. He knew that night. He knew completely, and he told me completely, and in the end he was right about all of it. The raccoons were real. The situation was real. And standing at the foot of those stairs, barefoot in a t-shirt in the middle of the night, clapping my hands and telling two wild animals to get out of my house, apparently worked. I still cannot fully explain that last part. I am not sure I ever will. But I know that the panel goes back in the doggy door every single night now, without exception, without fail, no matter what else I forget before I go to bed. Some lessons you only need to learn once. Next one story start now. The family photo showed a baby, but I never found any sign of an infant in the house. A newspaper from June 1959 sat on the kitchen table next to glasses that had been washed and set to dry, and when I finally looked at the family photograph hanging in the living room, I saw a mother holding a tiny infant that I had found no trace of anywhere in this abandoned house deep in the New Hampshire woods. That is the detail that has haunted me ever since I walked out of that house and never returned. The question that sits in my mind, refusing to be answered or forgotten or explained away. Where was the baby? What happened to that infant who appeared in the family photograph, but whose presence I could find no evidence of in the rooms I searched? There was no crib, no baby clothes, no bottles or blankets or any of the items that accumulate in a home where an infant lives. Just that image in the photograph, a mother holding a small bundle, and then nothing. As if that child had never existed beyond that single captured moment. I need to tell you this story from the beginning, from the moment I first saw that house through the trees. Because every detail matters when you are trying to understand something that makes no sense. When you are trying to piece together what happened to a family that vanished so completely, that even their dishes were left dirty in the sink. This happened a few years ago when I was hiking in northern New Hampshire. I am someone who loves the outdoors, loves exploring, loves finding places that exist outside the normal paths that most people walk. There is something about moving through wilderness, about being surrounded by trees and silence, and the absence of human civilization, that feeds something essential in me. And part of what I love most about hiking in remote areas is stumbling across the remnants of human habitation. The places where people once lived and worked and built their lives before abandoning them to the slow reclamation of nature. I have found old barns collapsed under the weight of decades, stone walls running through forests marking property boundaries that no one remembers, rusted equipment from logging operations or farms that failed and were left where they stood. Each of these discoveries feels like a small gift, a glimpse into history, a reminder that the wilderness I walked through was not always wilderness, but was once shaped and inhabited by people whose stories have been forgotten. So when I saw the house through the trees that day, half hidden by overgrown vegetation and fallen branches, I felt that familiar excitement, that pull toward exploration and discovery. This was exactly the kind of place I loved to find. An abandoned structure, clearly untouched for years, waiting to reveal whatever secrets it held. I approached carefully, picking my way through the undergrowth. There had once been a pathway leading to the house. I could see that. Stones had been laid to create a walking path. But those stones were now almost completely hidden under weeds and various other plants that had grown up through the gaps and spread across the surface. The pathway was still there if you knew what to look for, but it had been reclaimed by nature to the point where you could easily miss it entirely if you were not paying attention. The house itself was surrounded by grass that had grown tall and wild, punctuated by tree limbs that had fallen and been left where they landed. Getting to the front porch required navigating through this obstacle course of vegetation and debris, pushing aside branches and stepping carefully over hidden hazards. The front porch was small and constructed of bricks that now wore a thick coat of moss, that green fuzzy growth that appears on surfaces that stay damp and untouched. The moss covered the bricks so completely that their original color was barely visible. This alone told me that no one had walked on this porch in many, many years. Moss like that does not grow overnight. It takes time and complete absence of disturbance. The front door was still intact and appeared to be locked from the inside. This surprised me slightly, because often in abandoned houses you find that doors have been forced open by previous explorers or have simply deteriorated to the point where they no longer function as barriers. But this door was solid, properly closed, showing no signs of having been breached. I checked the windows next, looking for any that might be broken or open, any entry point that would allow me access to the interior without causing damage. The windows on the front of the house were covered in such a thick layer of dust and dirt that I could not see through them at all. They were completely opaque, turned into mirrors by the accumulation of grime. I tried to open them, thinking that perhaps the latches would give way even if I could not see inside. But the wood had warped and swelled from years of exposure to weather, expanding in its frame until the windows were locked in place as firmly as if they had been nailed shut. None of them would budge no matter how hard I tried. I stood there on the mossy brick porch for a moment, weighing my options. I could walk away, leave the house unexplored, never know what was inside. Or I could keep looking, circle around to the back, see if there might be another way in. The curiosity won, as it always does with me. I gave up on the front entrance, and instead made my way around to the back of the house, navigating through more overgrown grass and fallen branches, keeping my eyes open for any other interesting features or structures on the property. When I reached the back side of the house, I found a window that was slightly less dirty than the ones in front. The grime was still thick, but there was enough transparency that I could put my face close to the glass and peer inside. I could not see much. The interior was dark, and my viewing angle was limited. But I could make out an area rug on the floor, the kind of woven or braided rug that was common in older homes. And near the window I could see what looked like a small table, just the edge of it visible in my narrow field of vision. These glimpses were tantalizing, suggesting a furnished interior that had been left intact rather than stripped or vandalized. I decided to check the back door, knowing it was probably locked like the front, but hoping that maybe, just maybe, I would get lucky. The back door was indeed locked, but when I gave it a gentle push, testing the integrity of the frame, I felt it give slightly. The wood was loose and weak, deteriorated by years of moisture and temperature changes. It did not take much force at all to push the door open, breaking the frame in the process. I need to acknowledge what I was doing here. This was breaking and entering in the legal sense. I was forcing my way into a structure that I did not own and had no permission to enter. I understand that, but I also need to explain my reasoning, which may not excuse the action, but at least provides context. It was obvious that no one had been to this house in many, many years. The moss, the warped wood, the impenetrable layer of dust and dirt on the windows, all of it spoke to decades of complete abandonment. This was not someone's weekend cabin that they visited occasionally. This was not a property that anyone was maintaining or checking on. This was a place that had been left and forgotten, erased from memory, allowed to slowly decay without anyone caring enough to secure it or tear it down or do anything with it at all. And I have a genuine fascination with places like this. Not in a destructive or disrespectful way, but in a way that comes from a deep interest in history and in the stories that physical spaces tell about the people who once inhabited them. I could not just walk away without knowing what was inside. The mystery of it would have haunted me, the unanswered questions would have lived in my mind, and I would have regretted not taking the opportunity to document and understand this forgotten place. So I pushed the door open, breaking the weakened frame, and I stepped inside. What I saw took my breath away completely. I was standing in a kitchen, not an empty kitchen with bare walls and floors, not a stripped and vandalized space showing evidence of decay and intrusion, but a fully furnished, apparently functional kitchen that looked like it had been occupied until very recently, except for the thick layer of dust that covered absolutely everything. There were dirty dishes in the sink, plates and bowls and utensils sitting exactly where someone had left them after a meal, waiting to be washed. On the counter beside the sink was a drain board, one of those old wooden or metal racks where you set dishes to dry after washing them. On that drain board sat cups and glasses, turned upside down in the proper position for drying, but now covered in dust so thick that they were barely recognizable as glassware. There was a small kitchen table, the kind that a family of 4 or 5 might gather around for meals. On that table were drinking glasses, as if someone had set them out for the next meal. And beside the glasses was a newspaper. I walked closer to examine the newspaper, my heart already beating faster, because I had a sense of where this was going, what I was going to find. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but the date was still clearly visible. June 1959. June 1959. That was more than 60 years ago. 60 years since someone had sat at this kitchen table and read this newspaper. 60 years since those dishes had been used and left in the sink. 60 years since this kitchen had functioned as a kitchen rather than as a time capsule preserving a moment that should have passed into history decades ago. I looked around more carefully, trying to take in all the details. The cabinets were still stocked with dishes. I opened them one by one and found plates, bowls, serving dishes, all arranged neatly on shelves as if the owner might return at any moment and need to set the table for dinner. There was a tall pantry, the kind of storage cabinet that was common in kitchens before modern built-in cabinetry became standard. Inside that pantry were jars, mason jars, canning jars, filled with preserved fruits and vegetables that had obviously been prepared by hand. The seals were still intact on most of them, though the contents had long since spoiled, or fermented or transformed into something that was no longer recognizable as food. Everything was covered in dust. That thick, undisturbed dust that only accumulates in places where no one has walked. No air has circulated. No living thing has moved for years and years and years. I stood in that kitchen trying to process what I was seeing, trying to understand the implications. This family, whoever they were, had left dirty dishes in the sink, had left glasses on the table, had walked away from a home that was fully stocked and functional, and never come back. Why? What could cause a family to abandon their home so completely that they left dishes unwashed and newspapers unread? What emergency or tragedy or circumstance would make you walk away from everything you owned without even taking time to lock up properly or retrieve your belongings? I continued through the house, moving slowly, documenting everything with my eyes since I had not brought a camera on this hike. Each room I entered was the same, fully furnished, covered in dust and dirt, showing clear signs of rodent activity and insect damage, but otherwise intact, as if the residents had simply stepped out for a moment and intended to return. There were spider webs everywhere, thick and layered, the work of generations of spiders that had claimed this space as their own. In corners, along ceiling edges, spanning doorways, the webs created a ghostly decoration that caught the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. The dresser drawers in the bedrooms contained clothes that had been damaged by mice or other small rodents. I could see where nests had been built in the soft fabric, where material had been chewed and dragged and repurposed by animals that had no understanding of what these items had once meant to the humans who owned them. In the closets hung more clothes, items that had once been worn and cared for, but now showed the effects of decades of abandonment. The fabric had begun to deteriorate, falling apart from age and insect damage. Moths or other bugs had eaten holes through shirts and dresses and coats. I pulled out one item for closer inspection. It was a child's dress, small enough for a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. The fabric was fragile, but I could see that this dress had been handmade. The stitches were not machine perfect, but showed the slight irregularity of hand sewing, the kind of work that a mother or grandmother might do in the evenings, creating clothes for children because buying ready-made garments was expensive, or impractical, or simply not the way things were done in rural areas in the 1950s. There were 2 bedrooms. I explored both carefully, noting every detail. One bedroom was obviously a children's room. It contained 2 twin beds positioned parallel to each other, each bed perfectly made up with sheets and blankets and pillows arranged as if the children who slept there were expected to return that evening. The bedding was in very poor condition now, faded and damaged by time and insects and moisture, but I could see that it too had been handmade, hand-stitched, with the kind of care and attention that speaks to a time when such work was normal and expected. The other bedroom contained a single larger bed, presumably where the parents slept. This bed was also made up, also covered with handmade quilts or blankets, also waiting for occupants who never returned. I went into the bathroom, a small space with fixtures that were outdated even by 1959 standards. The cabinet above the sink held a few toiletries, a straight-edge razor, the kind that men used before safety razors became popular, some soap, a comb, simple items for basic grooming and hygiene. Towels were folded neatly and stored in the cabinet, but like everything else in the house, they had become homes for small animals. I could see evidence of nesting, of mice or other rodents that had burrowed into the soft fabric to create warm spaces for raising their young. At this point, standing in that bathroom looking at towels that had been carefully folded by human hands decades ago, and then claimed by mice, I felt a creeping sense of unease that I had been trying to ignore since entering the house. I felt like I was being watched, not in a vague, maybe this is just my imagination way, but in a specific, certain, someone is looking at me right now way. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up. My heartbeat was elevated. Every survival instinct I possessed was telling me that I needed to leave this place immediately. I decided to listen to those instincts. I had seen enough. I had satisfied my curiosity about the contents of the house. Now it was time to go. To get back outside into sunlight and fresh air, and away from this strange frozen moment, where someone's entire life had been preserved like an insect in amber. I started walking back through the short hallway that connected the bedrooms to the living room area, intending to exit through the back door the way I had entered. But as I passed through the hallway, I noticed something I had not paid attention to before. There were pictures hanging on the walls, framed photographs and artwork, the kind of decorations that personalize a space and turn a house into a home. My curiosity, even in the face of that growing sense of dread and urgency to leave, made me pause. I wanted to see who had lived here. I wanted to put faces to the family whose abandoned life I had been walking through. I stopped at one of the pictures hanging near the doorway of what I had identified as the parents' bedroom. It was covered in dust like everything else, the glass of the frame so dirty that I could not see what the picture showed. I used my hand to wipe away some of the dust, clearing a space large enough to view the image. It was a wedding photograph. A man and a woman in formal clothing. The style and quality of the image suggesting it had been taken in the 1940s or early 1950s. The photograph was very faded, the contrast degraded by time. I could also see what appeared to be mildew growing behind the glass, between the photograph and its protective covering, creating dark spots and stains that obscured portions of the image. I looked at their faces. These two people who had gotten married and built a life together and ended up here in this house deep in the New Hampshire woods. They looked happy in the photograph, or at least they wore the formal expressions that people adopted for important pictures in that era. There was no way to know from a single wedding photograph what kind of life they had lived together, whether they had been happy or troubled or somewhere in between. I moved to the next picture, wiping dust away to see what it showed. This one was less personal, a landscape or still life. The kind of generic artwork that people buy to fill space on walls. I checked a few more pictures as I moved through the house. Most were scenery or various still life subjects. Pleasant but impersonal, decoration rather than documentation. And then I found the family photograph. It was hanging in the living room near the front door, in a position where it would have been one of the last things you saw as you left the house, and one of the first things you saw when you entered. A place of honor for the kind of picture that defines who you are and what matters to you. This photograph was in worse condition than the wedding picture. The fading was more severe, the mildew damage more extensive. But I could still make out the essential details. A man, presumably the same man from the wedding photograph though older now. The years visible in his face and posture. A woman, also older than in the wedding picture, holding something in her arms. Two children sitting on the floor at their parents' feet, a boy and a girl based on their clothing and hair. And the item in the woman's arms, the thing she was holding so carefully, was a baby. A very small infant, wrapped in blankets, held the way mothers hold newborns who are only weeks or maybe even days old. I stared at that photograph for a long time, my mind working through the implications. There were two children's beds in the house, twin beds in the children's room, appropriate for the two older children shown sitting on the floor in this photograph. But I had seen no crib, no bassinet, no baby bed of any kind. No infant clothes, or blankets, or bottles, or diapers, or any of the countless items that accompany a baby in a household. The children in the photograph, the one sitting on the floor, would have been school age. Old enough to sleep in real beds, to dress themselves, to attend school. Their presence in the house made sense, matched the evidence I had found. But the infant? Where was the evidence of the infant? I went back through the house mentally, retracing my steps, trying to remember if I had missed something. A small crib tucked in a corner. A bureau drawer that had been converted into a sleeping space the way people sometimes did in poor households. Any sign at all that a baby had lived in this house? Nothing. I had found absolutely nothing that suggested an infant had been part of this family's life. I stood in that living room, staring at the family photograph, feeling my unease transform into something colder and more disturbing. Because there were only a few possible explanations for what I was seeing, and none of them were good. Maybe the baby had died. Infant mortality was much higher in the 1950s than it is now, especially in rural areas where access to medical care was limited. Maybe this photograph had been taken, this precious documentation of the complete family, and then shortly after the baby had died from illness or accident or any of the tragic circumstances that can claim a newborn life. But if that was the case, if the baby had died, then why did the family leave everything else behind? Why abandon the house with dishes in the sink and clothes in closets and food in the pantry? The death of a child is devastating, but it does not typically cause a family to walk away from their entire life without even packing a suitcase. Maybe something had happened to the entire family. Maybe they had left the house one morning for work and school. The father to whatever job he held, the older children to school, the mother and baby staying behind or accompanying them, and maybe they had never made it home. An accident, a disaster, something that killed or displaced all of them at once. But that did not explain the missing baby items either. If the infant was still alive when they left that final morning, there should have been a crib in the house, should have been baby clothes, should have been all the infrastructure of infant care. Or maybe the photograph was old. Maybe it had been taken years before they left the house, when there had been a baby in the family. And by the time they abandoned the house in 1959, that baby had grown up, was one of the older children whose beds I had seen, and all the infant items had long since been discarded or given away or stored somewhere I had not found. But that did not feel right either. The two children in the photograph looked like they were the right age to correspond to the two beds in the children's room. If one of them had been the baby, there should have been 3 children total. 3 beds, 3 sets of clothes in the closets. I could not make the numbers work. Could not make the evidence match. Could not solve the mystery of the infant who appeared in the family photograph, but whose presence I could find no trace of in the house. And standing there in that abandoned living room, with dust floating in the dim light, and the feeling of being watched pressing down on me from all sides, I decided that I did not need to solve this mystery. I needed to leave. I turned away from the family photograph, and walked quickly back through the house to the broken back door. I stepped outside into fresh air and sunshine, and the normal world where things made sense and time moved forward instead of stopping in June of 1959. I did not run, but I walked fast, moving away from the house, back through the overgrown yard and into the woods where the trail continued. I did not look back. I did not take a final look at the structure or try to memorize its location for a future visit. I just left. And I have never been back. And I never intend to go back. Because what I discovered that day was not just an abandoned house. It was a home. A family's home where they had lived and experienced life, and then mysteriously disappeared from, leaving behind every single thing they owned except themselves. It was as if this family had no idea they would never return when they walked out their front door that last time. The made beds, the stocked pantry, the newspaper on the table, all of it suggested they expected to come back, expected to finish reading the paper, to wash those dishes, to sleep in those beds again. But they never did. And what is even more disturbing is that it appears no one ever came looking for them. No relatives or friends who noticed their absence and came to check on them. No authorities who investigated what happened to a family that simply vanished. The house has sat undisturbed for decades, slowly being reclaimed by nature, with no indication that anyone knows or cares that the people who live there are gone. I have so many questions that I have no idea how to answer. What could cause an entire family to disappear? Where did they go? Why did they never come back? What happened to make them leave behind not just their house, but every possession they owned? And most haunting of all, what happened to the infant in the family photograph? Where was that baby when I walked through the house? Why was there no evidence that an infant had ever lived there? I have spent hours thinking about this, have lain awake at night running through scenarios, have researched missing persons and unsolved disappearances from New Hampshire in the late 1950s, trying to find any mention of a family that vanished without a trace. I have found nothing. No answers. No closure. Just the memory of that house frozen in time and the family photograph showing a baby that I could not account for. Sometimes I wonder if I should have taken that photograph with me. Should have documented it somehow, preserved it as evidence of whatever tragedy or mystery befell that family. But I was too unsettled, too eager to leave, too affected by the atmosphere of that place to think clearly about documentation. And maybe that is for the best. Maybe some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Maybe some questions should be left unanswered. But I cannot forget what I saw. Cannot stop thinking about the beds made up for occupants who never returned. The dishes waiting to be washed. The newspaper from June 1959 sitting on the kitchen table as if someone was going to finish reading it any moment. And I cannot stop thinking about the mother in the photograph, holding her tiny infant, surrounded by her family, smiling for the camera in a moment that was supposed to be preserved as a happy memory. What happened to them? Where did they go? Why did they leave everything behind? And where, in all that abandoned home with its preserved moment of family life, was any sign of the baby? I will never know. And that uncertainty, that unanswered question, will stay with me forever. So there you have it. I found a family's home hidden deep in the woods of northern New Hampshire. I broke in. I explored. I documented what I found. And I left with more questions than answers. With a mystery that has no resolution. With the haunting knowledge that somewhere a family vanished so completely that even their memory has been erased. The house is still there, presumably. Still sitting in those woods. Still filled with the possessions of people who disappeared more than 60 years ago. Still waiting for someone to come home who never will. I will not be going back to look for it. Once was enough. Once was more than enough. Because some places should stay forgotten. Some stories should remain untold. And some mysteries, like the missing infant from that family photograph, are better left unsolved. Last one story start now. My grandfather spoke to me 1 hour before he died, and I was 300 miles away when it happened. I need you to understand that clearly before I tell you the rest of this, because everything that follows depends on you believing that one impossible sentence. My grandfather, who was lying in a hospital bed surrounded by family I was not physically present with, spoke directly to me while I was alone in my apartment in a completely different part of the state. He spoke to me clearly enough that I heard every word. He told me things that I could not have known. And then, exactly 1 hour later, my mother called to tell me that he had passed away. This happened 5 days ago. I am writing this while it is still fresh, while the weight of it is still sitting on my chest in a way that makes it hard to breathe sometimes. While I am still trying to organize my thoughts around what I experienced, and what it means, and how I am supposed to carry it forward from here. 5 days ago, my grandfather died at the age of 102 years old. He was my last surviving grandparent, the last one. The final connection to that generation of my family. The people who had raised my parents, who had been the foundation that everything else was built on. And when he went, he took with him more than a century of living, more than a century of memory and experience, and all the particular wisdom that comes from watching the world change that many times over that many years. I was not there when it happened. I need to say that too, because it matters to the story. I was not in the hospital room. I was not holding his hand. I was not part of the family gathered around his bed in those final hours. I was 300 miles away, going about my regular day in my regular apartment, doing regular things that people do when they do not know that someone they love is about to leave the world. I had known he was declining. We all knew. When someone reaches 102 years old, you do not have the luxury of pretending that everything is going to continue indefinitely. You know, in the way that families know these things, that time is running out. You see the signs. You hear the updates from the relatives who live closer and can visit more often. You have the conversations where people speak carefully and use phrases like making him comfortable, and it could be any day now, and you nod, and you understand what is actually being communicated underneath those careful words. But knowing someone is dying and experiencing the actual moment of their death are two entirely different things. One is abstract, distant, something you carry with you as a fact, but not yet as a reality. The other is immediate and absolute, and changes everything in an instant. I was sitting in my living room when I felt him. That is the only way I know how to describe it. I felt his presence. Not saw, not heard, but felt. The way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. The way you feel someone looking at you from across a room even when you cannot see them. It was a shift in the atmosphere of my apartment. A sudden awareness that I was not alone even though I could see clearly that I was alone. And that awareness came with a specific, unmistakable knowledge of who was there. My grandfather. I have had experiences with this kind of thing before. I come from a family where certain sensitivities run in the blood, where my mother and my grandmother before her both had moments of knowing things they should not have been able to know, of sensing presences that other people could not sense, of receiving information through channels that the regular world does not acknowledge or account for. I grew up understanding that this was part of my inheritance. Part of what got passed down along with eye color and height and the shape of my hands. So when I felt my grandfather's presence in my living room that afternoon, I did not question it. I did not try to talk myself out of it or rationalize it away. I simply recognized it for what it was. He was there. Somehow, impossibly, he was there. I spoke to him out loud. I did not think about whether that was strange, or whether someone overhearing me would think I had lost my mind. I just spoke, the way you speak to someone who is in the room with you. Because in every way that mattered, in that moment, he was in the room with me. I said, "Grandpa, I know you're tired, but can't you hold on just a little longer?" I meant it. I meant it with everything I had. I knew he was dying, and I knew that holding on was probably asking more than was fair to ask. But I was not ready. I wanted more time. I wanted one more conversation, one more visit, one more chance to sit with him and hear him talk about his life in that way he had, where every story contained a dozen smaller stories, and every memory opened up into something larger. I wanted him to stay, just a little longer, just enough for me to get there, to be present, to say the things I needed to say before it was too late. And then he answered me. Not in my head. Not as a thought that I interpreted as communication. He answered me in words I heard as clearly as I have ever heard anything. In a voice that was absolutely, unmistakably his. The same voice that had read to me when I was small, that had told me stories about growing up during the Depression, that had sung old songs at family gatherings in a wavering tenor that got shakier as the years went on, but never lost its essential character. That voice, his voice, speaking directly into my ear, close enough that I could feel the presence of him beside me even though I could not see him. He said, "I can't. Not that I don't want to, I can't. Your grandma is here saying we have to go. She is as beautiful now as the day we were married." And then he was gone. The presence that had filled my living room, that had been so unmistakably and specifically him, simply withdrew. I felt it leave the same way I had felt it arrive. Like a change in pressure. Like air moving out of a space. One moment he was there, and the next moment I was alone again. Sitting in my living room, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened. I want to pause here and tell you about my grandmother, because she is central to understanding what my grandfather said to me, and why those words carried the weight they did. My grandmother had died 8 years earlier. She had been the love of my grandfather's life in a way that was visible to everyone who knew them. They had been married for 73 years. 73 years of waking up next to each other, of raising children together, of building a life that spanned nearly 3/4 of a century. They had met young, married young by today's standards, and had simply never stopped being in love. It was not a perfect marriage, because no marriage that lasts that long is perfect. But it was a deep one. A real one. The kind of partnership that becomes so fundamental to who you are, that losing it feels like losing a piece of your own structure. When my grandmother died, my grandfather grieved in a way that was quiet, but complete. He did not fall apart dramatically. He did not stop functioning. But something in him shifted. Something essential, and those of us who knew him well could see it. He was still present, still engaged with his family, still capable of laughing at jokes and enjoying meals, and participating in the ongoing life of the people around him. But there was a part of him that had gone somewhere else, to wherever she was, and it never fully came back. He spoke about her often after she died, not in a morbid way, not dwelling on the loss, but in the way of someone who was keeping her close, by remembering her out loud. He would mention things she had said, things she had liked, moments they had shared. He kept her photograph beside his bed. He talked to her sometimes when he thought no one was listening. Little one-sided conversations that were tender and matter-of-fact and completely unself-conscious. We all knew that when his time came, he would go to her. That sounds like a romantic notion, the kind of thing people say about elderly couples to make death feel less harsh. But with my grandfather it was more than that. It was a certainty. He had stayed for us, for his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, longer than he probably wanted to. But when the moment arrived, we all understood that he would not be staying any longer. He would be going to where she was. And that is exactly what he told me. "Your grandma is here. She is as beautiful now as the day we were married. We have to go. Not I have to go. We have to go." He was with her already. Somehow, in whatever space exists between living and dying, between being here and being gone, he was already with her. She had come for him. She was there, waiting, beautiful and whole and young in the way he remembered her from the very beginning of their life together. And she was telling him it was time. I sat in my living room after he left and I did not move for a long time. I could not. My body felt too heavy, my mind too full, the reality of what had just happened too large to fit inside the normal dimensions of an afternoon. I knew what it meant. I knew with absolute certainty that my grandfather had just said goodbye to me. That the presence I had felt was him in his final moments, reaching out across the distance to the grandchild, who was not there. And that I would not feel that presence again. I also knew, with that same certainty that my phone was going to ring soon. It did. 1 hour later, almost to the minute, my mother called. I saw her name on the screen and I answered, already knowing what she was going to say. There was a particular quality to my own calm in that moment that I am still trying to fully understand. I was not surprised. I was not shocked. I was sad, deeply sad. Sad in a way that made my chest hurt and my eyes sting. But I was not caught off guard. Because I had already been told. I had already received the news from the only person who could have delivered it in a way that would have meant what it meant. My mother's voice was strained when she spoke. She had been crying, was still crying, trying to hold it together long enough to make the calls she needed to make to family members who were not at the hospital. She said my name, and then she paused, and I could hear her taking a breath, steadying herself. She said, "He's gone. Grandpa passed away about an hour ago. We were all with him. It was peaceful." I did not tell her right then. I could not. She was in her own grief, her own process of absorbing the loss of her father, and this was not the moment to add something that would require explanation or processing. So I simply told her I loved her. Told her I was sorry I had not been there. Told her I would come as soon as I could. All the things you say in those moments when there is nothing adequate to say, but you have to say something anyway. But after we hung up, I sat with what I knew. He had come to me first. Before my mother called. Before anyone in my family who was not in that hospital room knew that he had died. He had come to me. He had spoken to me. He had told me in his own words that he could not stay. That my grandmother was there. That they had to go together. And the timing was exact. My mother said he had passed about an hour ago. I looked at the clock when she called, and I counted backwards, and the math lined up perfectly with the moment I had felt him in my living room, the moment he had spoken to me, the moment he had left. He had died, and in dying, he had reached out. To me specifically, across 300 miles, across whatever distance separates the living from the dead. He had reached out to the grandchild who was not there, and he had said goodbye. I need to tell you what that means to me, because it is not a small thing. I was the youngest of his grandchildren, not the one he was closest to geographically, not the one who saw him most often in his final years, not the one who was there holding his hand when he took his last breath. I was far away, both in distance and in the practical ability to be present during his decline. And yet he came to me, in his final moments, in whatever capacity he still had to make choices about where to direct his energy and his awareness. He chose to come to me. I have thought about that constantly over the past 5 days. I have turned it over and examined it from every possible angle, trying to understand what it means about him, about me, about the connection we had, about the nature of what happens when we die. My grandfather was not a particularly religious man. He believed in something, had a sense of there being more to existence than just the material world, but he was not someone who spent a lot of time talking about the afterlife, or what he thought happened when you died. He lived his life focused on the people in front of him, the relationships he was building and maintaining, the love he could give and receive in the immediate, tangible present. But he also understood, in the way that people who live to be very old sometimes understand, that there are layers to reality that we do not see most of the time. That the world is stranger and more complicated than we give it credit for. That there are moments when the ordinary rules do not fully apply. He knew I had the same sensitivity his daughter had, the same ability to perceive things that existed just slightly outside the normal range of human awareness. He had seen it in me as a child, had recognized it the way my mother had recognized it, and he had never treated it as something strange or frightening. He had simply accepted it as part of who I was, the same way he accepted everything else about the people he loved. So when his moment came, when he was standing at the edge of his life looking at what came next, he knew that I would be able to hear him if he spoke. He knew that the distance did not matter, that physical presence was not required, that he could reach me wherever I was if he chose to. And he did choose to. Out of all the people he could have spent his final conscious energy reaching toward, he came to me. I think he came to me because he knew I would believe him. He knew I would not dismiss what I experienced, or talk myself out of it, or spend years wondering whether it had been real. He knew I would hear him and accept what I heard as true, and carry it with me as the gift it was meant to be. And it was a gift. That is what I have come to understand in the days since. It was not just a goodbye. It was not just him letting me know that he was leaving. It was him giving me the most important piece of information I could possibly have received in that moment. He was not alone. He was not afraid. He was with her. My grandmother, the woman he had loved for more than 70 years, was there waiting for him. She was whole and beautiful, and exactly as he remembered her, from the best moments of their life together. And they were leaving together, the way they had done everything together. As partners, as a unit, as two people who had never really learned how to be separate. That is what he wanted me to know. That is what he crossed the distance to tell me. That death was not the end of their love. That whatever came next included her. That he was going somewhere, and she was already there. And everything was going to be all right. I bawled my eyes out after my mother's call. I sat on my couch, and I cried the way you cry when someone you love is gone, and there is nothing you can do to bring them back. I cried for my grandfather, for the 102 years of life that had just ended, for all the conversations we would never have, and all the moments I would never get to share with him. I cried for my mother, who had just lost her father. I cried for my family, who had gathered around his bedside and watched him go. I cried for myself, for the particular loneliness of being the last one in my generation to lose all of their grandparents. For the way that loss marked the end of something I had taken for granted my entire life. But I also cried because of what he had told me, because he had given me something in those final moments that I did not fully know I needed until I had it. He had given me certainty, not faith, not hope, not belief, but actual knowledge. He had shown me, as directly as it is possible to show someone anything, that consciousness continues, that love continues, that the people we lose are not simply gone into nothing, but are somewhere, in some form, still themselves, still connected to the people they loved, still capable of reaching back across the divide to let us know that they are all right. I am not a particularly religious person either. I was not raised with a strong doctrine about what happens after death, and I have spent most of my adult life uncertain about what I actually believe. But I do not need belief anymore, at least not about this specific thing. I have direct experience. I have my grandfather's voice in my ear telling me that my grandmother is there and that she is beautiful, and that they have to go together. That is not something I will ever be able to doubt or dismiss or explain away. It happened. It was real. And it changed something fundamental in how I understand the world. I have been thinking about all the other times in my life when I have felt presences I could not see, heard things I could not explain, known things I should not have been able to know. I have spent so much time questioning those experiences, holding them at arm's length, wondering whether I was making them up, or reading too much into coincidence or letting my imagination run away with me. But this one, this final conversation with my grandfather, does not leave room for that kind of doubt. There is no version of this story where I imagined it. There is no version where it was coincidence that I felt his presence, and heard his voice exactly 1 hour before my mother called to tell me he had died. There is no rational explanation for the specificity of what he said, for the detail about my grandmother being there, for the description of her as beautiful the way she was when they were young. Those were not things I would have invented. Those were not details my grieving mind would have pulled out of nowhere to comfort itself. Those were his words, his voice, his message, and now I carry them with me. I went to the funeral 3 days later. I drove the 300 miles I had not been able to cross in time to see him before he died, and I stood with my family, and I listened to people talk about his life, and his character, and all the things he had meant to the people who knew him. I heard stories I had heard before, and stories I had not. I saw photographs from every era of his long life. From the young man he had been when he married my grandmother, to the elderly man he had become in his final years. I did not tell anyone what had happened. Not yet. Not in that setting, not when everyone was processing their own grief in their own way. But I knew that at some point I would. I knew that my mother, especially, needed to hear this. She needed to know that her father had not simply slipped away quietly in a hospital bed. He had reached out. He had said goodbye, and he had told us, through me, that he was with his wife again, that they were together, that everything he had been holding on for was done and he could finally go home to her. I am telling you this story now, because it is still fresh, still raw, still sitting in me like something too large to keep entirely to myself. I am telling you because I think there are other people out there who have had experiences like this. Moments when someone they loved reached across the impossible distance and made contact. And I want those people to know that they are not alone. That these things happen. That they are real. I am also telling you because I want you to understand what my grandfather gave me in those final moments. He gave me proof. Not the kind of proof that would satisfy a skeptic or stand up in a laboratory, but the kind of proof that matters when you are the one receiving it. The kind of proof that settles into your bones and changes how you see everything that comes after. He is gone now. His body was buried next to my grandmother's in the cemetery where several generations of my family are laid to rest. The funeral is over. The relatives have gone back to their own lives. And the world has continued moving forward the way the world always does when someone dies. But I carry his voice with me. I carry the knowledge of what he told me. I carry the certainty that wherever he is now, he is with her and they are together. And that love does not end just because breathing does. That is what my grandfather whispered in my ear 1 hour before he died. That is what I will carry for the rest of my life.